You don't move to Japan to become the most dangerous woman in Osaka. You move to Japan because you're 27 and your life in Chicago has the structural integrity of a building that was never inspected. You have an MBA that your parents are proud of and you have spent 3 years using it to manage supply chains for a pharmaceutical company whose ethical compass, you have recently discovered, points consistently toward profit and nowhere else. You are good at your job. You are also slowly becoming someone you don't recognize in the mirror, which is its own kind of emergency. Your therapist says burnout. Your body says something more specific. You are disappearing. You request a transfer to the Tokyo office. Your company has won. You have been aware of it the way you are aware of a fire exit, present, relevant only in emergencies, suddenly very relevant. They say yes because you are good at what you do and because nobody else wants to go. You land in Tokyo on a gray November morning with 2 suitcases, a laptop, and the faint and entirely rational terror of someone who has just moved to a country where they speak none of the language and know exactly one person, who is a colleague they have met twice on Zoom. The Tokyo office is smaller than Chicago. The work is the same work. The city is larger than anywhere you have ever lived, and somehow more precise. 14 million people moving through it with a calibration that makes you feel perpetually, pleasantly wrong about where you're going. You find an apartment in Shimikitazawa, a neighborhood that manages to be both deeply Tokyo and slightly eccentric, vintage shops, small live music venues, streets too narrow for cars that have decided to be pedestrian by default. You eat at the same ramen counter 4 nights a week because the owner recognizes you now, and that is the closest thing to community you have assembled in 2 months. You are fine. You are building fine. You are also aware that fine is what you left Chicago to get away from. And then on a Tuesday in January in a conference room in Shinjuku, you meet Kenji Mori. The meeting is about supply chain compliance. Your company is evaluating partnerships with several Japanese distributors. Kenji Mori presents one of them, a mid-sized logistics and distribution company called Mori Transports. He is there to present their compliance framework. He is not what you expect from a compliance presentation. He is 32. Lean, direct, the kind of composed that comes from discipline rather than ease. He presents the compliance data, without performance. No charm offensive, no practiced warmth, just the information delivered with the specific efficiency of someone who prepared thoroughly and considers the preparation to be the courtesy. When one of your colleagues asks a question that is slightly off target, he answers the question behind the question instead of the question that was asked. You notice this. You notice it because it is what you do, and you have never seen someone else do it in a meeting. After the presentation, when the room is clearing, he says to you, without preamble, without the social scaffolding that most people use, your due diligence questions were the right questions. You say, your data was organized to answer different questions. He looks at you. You look at him. He says, yes. Most people don't notice that. You say, I notice things. He says, I know. The meeting ends. He gives you his card. You give him yours. You go back to your office and spend 4 minutes looking at his card and then put it in the drawer and go back to work and think about the meeting for the rest of the day in a way that has nothing to do with supply chains. He emails 3 days later. Not about the compliance data. He says there is a restaurant in Nakameguro that is doing something interesting with fermentation and asks if you would like to try it. It is the most direct invitation you have ever received. No ambiguity, no hedging, no elaborate construction of plausible deniability. Just, there is a thing, would you like to do it? You write back, yes. The restaurant is small and serious, and the chef comes out to explain each course in Japanese, and Kenji translates not the description but the intention, what the dish is trying to say about the season, about the ingredient, about the relationship between what something was and what it has become. You eat something you cannot identify, and it is the best thing you have eaten in months. He asks about Chicago. You tell him the truth, not the professional version, the actual version. The disappearing in the mirror. The transfer as emergency exit. He listens the way certain people listen, which is to say, completely. No parallel processing. No preparation of response. Just receiving what you are saying. You ask about the logistics company. He says, it is my father's company. I run the operations. You say, does your father still run it? He is quiet for a moment. Then, my father runs other things. The company is mine now in practice. You file this the way you file things that are interesting and incomplete. You don't push, he doesn't offer more. The dinner continues. What you know at the end of the evening. He is precise, honest in the specific way off someone who has decided accuracy is a form of respect, and he has the specific quality of a person who has been in rooms he did not choose and has learned to be genuinely present in them anyway. What you don't know. Almost everything. You see each other 7 times before he says anything that changes the shape of what you know. 7 dinners, 1 museum visit, 1 Sunday morning walk through Yanaka that turns into 4 hours because the neighborhood keeps offering reasons to stay. He knows the city the way people know things that were built into them, not the tourist layer, not the expat comfortable layer, but the actual material of it. The shop that has been selling the same incense since 1867. The family whose house survived the earthquake and the bombing and stands now in the middle of a block that rebuilt around it. The specific geography of who owes what to whom across 3 generations. He tells you these things the way people tell you things that cost them something to know. Not tour guide narration. Inheritance. On the 7th evening, at his apartment in Minami Aoyama, where he has cooked dinner because he said the restaurant he had in mind was fully booked and you suspect this is not true, he puts down his chopsticks and looks at you and says, I need to tell you something before this goes further. You've been expecting this sentence for approximately 4 dinners. You set down your own chopsticks. He says, my father is not a logistics executive. You say, I know. He looks at you. You say, I did my due diligence. That is literally my job. He is quiet for a long moment. Then, what do you know? You tell him what you found. The name, the organization, the Oyabun, the Morigumi, operating out of Osaka, Kobe, the shadow half of the legitimate business his father built over 30 years. You found it in a week. You didn't need to look hard. He says, and you kept coming to dinner. You say, I wanted to know if you were going to tell me. He says, that was a test. You say, everything is a test when the stakes are high enough. He says nothing for a long time. Then, I am not my father. You say, I know that too. He says, but I am his son. And that means something in this world whether I want it to or not. You say, tell me what it means. He does. He tells you at the kitchen table with the dishes between you and the city outside the window, and the specific quality of honesty that comes from someone who has been waiting to say something for longer than the conversation they're in. His father built the Morigumi from the docks of Osaka over 30 years. Kenji grew up inside the organization the way children grow up inside their parents' businesses, not understanding it fully but shaped by its rhythms, its language, its specific system of obligation and loyalty that is older than any of the individual people inside it. At 22, he left. Or tried to. He went to university in Tokyo. He studied business, specifically logistics and supply chain, the legitimate half of what his father built, the part that could be extracted from the rest and made clean. He spent 10 years building Mori Transports into a real company, one whose books are open, whose practices are auditable, whose growth does not depend on anything that cannot be shown to a regulator. He did this, he says, because he decided very early that he wanted the part of his inheritance that could be kept in the light, and none of the part that couldn't. But here's the thing about being the son of a Yakuza boss. You do not simply leave. The organization is not a job. It is a family in the structural sense. Obligation and loyalty moving in all directions, the whole thing held together by relationships that predate any individual's decision about whether they want to be part of it. His father is still the Oyabun. His uncles are still in the organization. Men he grew up knowing are still the men his father depends on. He exists in the gap between the life his father built and the life he is trying to build separately. This gap is not comfortable. It is not even stable. It is a negotiation that has been ongoing for 10 years and that his father has accepted with the specific patience of a man who believes his son will return to the fold when the appropriate moment arrives. Kenji believes his father is wrong. He also knows that believing something and it being true are different categories and that the difference between them is where most of the danger lives. He says, I am telling you this because what I want with you, specifically, is something I cannot build on a foundation with cracks in it. And the crack is the thing I just told you. You sit with this for a long time. Then you say, What does your father think about me? He says, he doesn't know about you yet. You say, when he finds out? He says, that is the part one I've been thinking about. You say, tell me what you've been thinking. He says, I've been thinking that I need to tell him before he finds out from someone else. And I've been thinking about what it means to bring you into his awareness. Because once you are in his awareness, you are in his calculation. And his calculations are not always safe for the people inside them. You say, are you asking me to make a decision? He says, I am giving you the information the decision requires. You look at him across the kitchen table. He looks at you. You say, you've been doing this since the compliance presentation. Answering the question behind the question. He says, yes. You say, the question behind the question is, do I stay knowing what I know? He says, yes. You say, I need to think. He says, take the time you need. He does not ask you to hurry. He does not soften what he has said. He does not offer you a version that is easier to accept. He gives you the real thing and waits. This, you will understand later, is who Kenji Mori is. And it is the reason for everything that comes after. You think for 2 weeks. You go to work. You manage your supply chains. You eat at the ramen counter. You walk through Shimikitazawa in the February cold and think about the decision the way you think about complex problems, by taking it apart into its components and examining each one. Component 1. Kenji himself. What you know from 7 dinners and 1 long walk and the kitchen table. Precise, honest, disciplined in the specific way of someone who has decided their character is something they build deliberately rather than receive. The compliance presentation where he answered the question behind the question. The way he listens. The dinner where he cooked and the restaurant was almost certainly not booked. Component 2. The father. Shiro Mori, Oyabun, 67 years old, 3 decades of building something that is half legitimate and half not, and has made him untouchable in Osaka in the specific way of men who have enough relationships across enough categories of power that approaching them directly is simply never done. He does not know you exist. This will change. Component 3. The gap. The 10 years Kenji has spent building the legitimate half and the ongoing negotiation about whether the gap between his life and his father's can be maintained permanently. His father believes it cannot. Kenji believes it can. This disagreement is not abstract. It has stakes. Component 4. You. You have spent 3 years disappearing into a job that was slowly replacing you with its own requirements. You came to Japan to stop disappearing. You have found over 7 dinners, the first person in a very long time who sees you specifically. Not the job, not the credentials, the actual person underneath. You are aware that this is precisely the kind of reasoning that leads people into decisions they shouldn't make. You are also aware that the decisions you were supposed to make have led you to an empty apartment in Chicago and a mirror that showed you someone you didn't want to be. On the 14th day, you call him. You say, I'm not leaving Tokyo. He is quiet for a moment. Then, okay. He says it without relief, without triumph. He says it the way you say something you have been certain of and are now receiving confirmation of. You say, but I need to meet your father before this goes any further. He says, I know. You say, on my terms. He says, tell me your terms. You say, I want to walk in knowing exactly what I'm walking into. No surprises from your side. No management. Just the actual situation. He says, yes. He says it simply. No negotiation. No softening. This is what you asked for, and he agrees to it because he asked you to stay, and this is what staying costs, and he knew that before you called. You say, okay then. He says, okay. You hang up and sit in your apartment and look at the city outside the window and think, this is either the best decision or the most catastrophic one, and the terrifying thing is that you genuinely cannot tell which yet. Shiro Mori's house is in the hills above Osaka. Traditional construction. A gate. Men at the gate with the specific posture of men whose job is to be between their employer and whatever their employer does not want near him, a garden that has been tended for 40 years. A koi pond. The fish are enormous and unhurried, and they have been here long enough that the garden was designed around them rather than the other way. Kenji drove 3 hours from Tokyo, almost no conversation, Not because there was tension between you, but because the drive was its own kind of preparation, and you both understood that. Shiro Mori meets you in the main room. He is compact and silver-haired, and still in the specific way of a man who stopped needing to demonstrate authority some decades ago. He has the eyes of someone who has assessed people for a living for 40 years, and is currently assessing you. The assessment is not hostile. It is simply thorough. He looks at you for a long moment. Then he says in Japanese, which Kenji does not translate, "She came." Kenji says also in Japanese, "She asked to." Shiro looks at you again. Something in his expression shifts fractionally. Tea is served. The conversation begins. He asks about Chicago. He asks about your work. He asks about your family. The questions are the questions of a man conducting an interview that he has already decided the outcome of and is now simply establishing a record. You answer directly, without performance, without the careful diplomacy that the situation might seem to call for. When he asks what you know about his business, you tell him what you found in a week's due diligence. He is quiet for a moment. Then he says something in Japanese and Kenji says, "He says you're thorough." When he asks why you're still here, knowing what you know, you say, "Because your son is the most honest person I have met in 3 years. And I don't leave honest people." Shiro looks at you for a long time. Then he says in English, clearly and without the interpreter, "You understand what this family is." You say, "I understand what you built. I also understand what your son is building." He says, "They are not separate." You say, "He believes they are." He says, "What do you believe?" You say, "I believe he has earned the right to find out." Another long silence. The kind of silence in which decisions are being made that will not be discussed. Then Shiro Mori picks up his teacup. He drinks. He sets it down. He says to Kenji in Japanese, "She'll do." Kenji translates. His expression, the fractional shift of someone receiving news they were uncertain about. You say, "What does that mean?" Kenji says, "It means he accepts you." You say, "That's it." Kenji says, "That is everything." You drive back to Tokyo. 3 hours. More conversation this time. The city coming toward you, out of the February dark. He says, that was the hardest conversation he has had in 10 years. You say, "For which of you?" He says, "Both." You say, "What happens now?" He says, "Now we build the thing I have been building toward. Carefully. With full information. The way it should have been built from the beginning." You say, "Tell me what that looks like." He does. The whole drive home. What it looks like, a year of navigation. That is the honest name for what comes next. Not romance, navigation. The word is Kenji's, said one evening over dinner in the Shimikatazawa apartment that has slowly become the apartment for both of you without either of you having formally proposed the arrangement. The navigation has specific coordinates. Mori Transports continues to grow. You are not employed there. You have kept your position at the pharmaceutical company specifically to maintain the separation, which Kenji understands as the line you need and respects without being asked to discuss it. But you understand the business deeply, the same way you understand anything deeply, which is through sustained attention and specific questions, and there are evenings when the dinner table becomes a working session because the problem in front of you is interesting enough that the distinction between dinner and work dissolves. He is good at what he does. You understood this from the compliance presentation, and you understand it more fully now. The logistics company he has built is real, genuinely competitive, not sustained by the shadow of what his father built, profitable on its own terms. He has done something that most people told him was impossible, which is to take the legitimate half of his inheritance and make it self-sustaining. His father watches this. You don't know exactly what Shiro Mori makes of it because you see him 4 times in the year, and each time the conversation is direct and brief, and ends with that same specific quality of assessment rather than expression. He is not warm. He is not cold. He is present in the specific way of a man who is still deciding something. What he is deciding, you understand slowly, is whether Kenji's way works, whether the gap can be maintained. Whether the son who left can build something real enough on the legitimate side to make the argument that the two halves don't need to be reconciled. This is the negotiation that has been ongoing for 10 years. You are now inside it. The navigation also has hazards. There are men who come to see Shiro Mori, men from the organization, the actual organization, the half that is not in any annual report. They know Kenji's name the way everyone in the organization knows Kenji's name. Most of them see him as the son who left. A few see him as the heir, who hasn't arrived yet. The distinction matters. There is a man named Tadashi who has been with the Morigumi for 20 years and Hoi's, by any measure, the second most powerful person in the organization. He is polite to Toyou in the way that people are polite when politeness is a form of assessment. His bow when he sees Kenji has the specific quality of deference that doesn't quite commit, respectful but reserved, as if the full bow is being withheld against a future calculation. Kenji notices this. He says nothing about it to you. For 3 months. When he does mention it, it is not as a concern but as a data point. Tadashi is recalibrating. You say, recalibrating to what? He says, to the possibility that the gap holds. You say, is that good or bad? He says, it depends on whether the recalibration ends in acceptance or in a conclusion that the gap needs to be closed. You say, who closes it? He looks at you. You say, I mean who closes it, from his perspective, your father or Tadashi? He says, that is exactly the right question. You say, what's the answer? He says, I don't know yet. You file this. You don't push. The navigation continues. The proposal happens in March, 14 months after the compliance presentation. Not with ceremony. Not with an arranged setting or a speech or anything that requires the moment to be more than it is. You are in the kitchen of the Shimikatazo apartment at 7 in the morning on a Sunday. He has made coffee. You are reading something on your phone. He sits across from you and puts a small box on the table between your coffee cups. He says, I have been thinking about what I want this to be. You look at the box. You look at him. He says, I want it to be the thing I am building that is not connected to what my father built. The thing that is only mine. The thing that I chose completely. He says, I want it to be you. You open the box. The ring is simple and specific. A thin gold band with a single stone that catches the morning light in the specific way of something chosen with attention. You say, you chose it yourself. He says, yes. You say, without asking anyone. He says, yes. You say yes. He puts the ring on your finger. You both drink your coffee. You spend the rest of the morning doing nothing in particular, which turns out to be exactly the right way to spend the morning after saying yes to something enormous. Later, you will tell your mother on a video call. She will have questions. Many questions. The answers to some of them will require significant omission. You will manage this with the specific skill of someone who has learned in the navigation the difference between a lie and a necessary boundary. Later, Kenji will call his father. That conversation is 45 minutes. Kenji does not tell you everything that was said. What he tells you is this. His father said yes. His father also said, in the specific language of a man who communicates in subtext, that Kenji now has obligations. The obligations are not enumerated. They don't need to be. You say, what obligations? He says, the ones that come with being officially his son rather than the son who left. You say, is there a difference? He says, yes. There is a difference between a man who left and a man who left and Isno bringing something back. You say, what are you bringing back? He says, a version of this that can continue cleanly, without the parts that can't be sustained. You say, does your father believe that's what you're doing? He says, he believes I believe it. You say, and Tadashi? He is quiet for a moment. He says, Tadashi's recalibration is ongoing. The wedding is in Kyoto. Kenji chose Kyoto because it is not Osaka, not his father's city, not the geography of the organization. A neutral ground, a place where the ceremony can be the thing it is without being in the shadow of the thing it's adjacent to. Your mother flies in from Chicago. She is, as it turns out, the bravest person at the ceremony, and she doesn't know it. She walks into the receiving room, where 40 of Kenji's father's associates are gathered in formal dress, and she says to the nearest one, is there assigned seating? He bows and shows her to her place. She later says everyone was extremely well organized. You do not provide full context. The ceremony is Shinto, a priest who moves through rites that are older than any of the complications present in the room. You wear a white kimono for the ceremony, borrowed from Kenji's aunt, who adjusted it herself without comment and with the air of a woman who has been through several configurations of this family and is reserving final judgment for later. Shiro Mori sits in the front row. His expression during the ceremony is the expression he always has, assessment. But at one moment, during the exchange of sake cups, Thisen Sankudo, the 9 sips that formalize the marriage, he looks not at the cups but at Kenji. And his expression changes by 1 degree. Just 1. Just enough. You see it. Kenji does not see it because he is looking at you. You file it in the same place you file all the things that require time to understand. After the ceremony, when the formal receiving line has concluded and the guests are at the dinner tables, Shiro Mori finds you standing briefly alone near the garden doors. He stands beside you. He does not look at you. He looks at the garden. He says in English, "He is not what I built him to be." You say, "No." He says, "He is better." He does not wait for your response. He moves back toward the tables. You stand at the garden doors for another moment. You think, this is the closest thing to a blessing available from this specific M.A.N.it is enough. You go back to your husband. The first year of the marriage is the year you learn what the navigation actually costs. Not dramatically. Not in the ways you anticipated. In the small accumulated ways of a life that requires constant calibration. There are things you do not ask about. Not because you are told not to, but because you understand quickly that the question is itself a kind of pressure, that demanding details of the parts of Kenji's relationship with his father's world that he has not offered is demanding either a lie or a complicity you haven't chosen. You have drawn your line. The line holds because you hold it. There are men who know Kenji from before, men from the organization, men from his father's world, men who grew up knowing the Mori name as belonging to something specific. They treat him with the specific deference of the organization, not the business. Kenji receives this with the practiced neutrality of someone who has been receiving it for 30 years and knows that the correct response is neither to accept it fully nor to reject it visibly. You watch him manage this. You understand, watching, what it costs. The logistics company grows. A major contract with the European Shipping Consortium. A second distribution center in Kobe. The board of directors is legitimate, accountants and logistics professionals, and a former regulator who joined specifically because the company's books are clean. Kenji works with the focus of someone who knows that the thing he is building has to be unambiguously real in order to make the argument it exists to make. You make your own argument through your work. Your company promotes you to regional director, Southeast Asia and Japan. The role requires travel, Tokyo and Singapore and occasionally further, and this means there are weeks when you and Kenji are managing the marriage across time zones and Zoom calls in inconvenient hours. You manage it. You are both, by disposition and by necessity, very good at managing difficult logistics. What you did not anticipate, and you are honest with yourself about this, is how much you would come to love the specific texture of the life you are inside. Not the danger of it. Not the proximity to the organization and its shadow. But the city, the neighborhood, the ramen counter where the owner knows your order, the Sunday mornings in the Shimikitazawa apartment with coffee, and the city outside, and someone who sees you specifically. The years off being seen specifically after years of disappearing. Kenji notices what you love. He notices the way he notices everything, completely, without making a performance of the noticing. He tells you about the city the way you tell someone about a place that made you. Not the tourist layer. The material. The family that has run the same dry goods shop since the Meiji Restoration. The temple that survived everything and is now surrounded by apartments that have learned to accommodate it. The specific geography of obligation and loyalty across generations that makes Tokyo what it is. A city that holds its history inside its present without ceremony. You love the city. You also love the man who shows it to you. Both things are true and neither one is uncomplicated. Tadashi's recalibration ends in the second year. You know because Kenji tells you. Not immediately, not completely, but enough. There is a meeting in Osaka that Kenji attends without telling you the full nature of it. He comes home from it changed by 1 degree in a way that you have learned to read, quieter than usual in the specific quality of quiet that means something has happened and is being processed. You don't ask that evening. You make dinner. You sit together. You are present without requiring. The next morning over coffee he tells you, Tadashi has made a proposition. Not to Kenji directly. To Shiro. The proposition is, in its most stripped form, this. The gap between Kenji's world and the organization needs to be resolved. The resolution Tadashi proposes is that Kenji takes a formal role. Not just as the Oyabun son. As the heir. The acknowledged heir. The transition that Shiro has always assumed would happen, made official. Shiro told Kenji. Kenji told Shiro no. Then Shiro told Kenji that Tadashi is not the kind of man who hears no from the son when the father has not said it. You sit with this for a moment. Then you say, "What does your father want?" Kenji says, "My father wants what he has always wanted. The gap to close. His son to come back." You say, "What is he going to do about Tadashi?" Kenji says, "That is the question." You say, "Is there an answer?" He says, "There is always an answer in my father's world. The answer is not always one I would choose." You say, "What would you choose?" He says, "I have been thinking about that for the past 24 hours. You say, "Tell me what you're thinking." He does. He is thinking about the gap. He is thinking about the 10 years he has spent building the legitimate side. He is thinking about what it means to have built something real and whether what he has built is strong enough now to make the argument that needs to be Medito, the people who need to hear it. He is thinking about you. He says, "What I want is not changed. What I want is the life I have been building. The company. This apartment. You." He says, "What I need to figure out is whether wanting it is enough to protect it." You say, "From Tadashi." He says, "From the version of this where Tadashi's calculation is correct. Where the gap closes not because I chose it but because I didn't move fast enough to prevent it." You say, "What does moving fast enough look like?" He says, "It looks like the thing I have been avoiding for 3 years. You say, "Which is?" He says, "Having the conversation with my father that makes this permanent. Not the negotiation. The conversation that ends the negotiation." You say, "What does that conversation do?" He says, "It either ends with my father accepting that the gap is permanent, that I am his son and I love him and I am not coming back, or it ends with something else." You say, "What is the something else?" He is quiet for a long time. He says, "I don't know yet, but I know that having the conversation is better than letting Tadashi's timeline become the only timeline available." You look at him across the coffee table in the Shimikitazawa apartment in the February morning light. You say, "When?" He says, "Soon." You say, "Do you want me there?" He considers. He says, "No, this is mine to do." You say, "Okay." He says, "If something," you say, "I know." He says, "The company documents are in," you say, "Kenji." He looks at you. You say, "I know. I have always known where the documents are. I have always known what to do. That is what it means to be inside this with my eyes open. You don't need to brief me." He is quiet for a moment. Then he says, "No, I don't." He says, "That is the thing that is different about you." You say, "What is?" He says, "You didn't need me to explain the map. You already drew it." You sit together in the morning for a while longer. Then he goes to Osaka. He is gone for 4 days. You work. You manage your supply chains. You eat at the ramen counter. You do not call because you agreed not to unless necessary, and the agreement was the right agreement, and you hold it. On the 4th day, he comes home. He is different in a way that you recognize, not the processing quiet, not the management quiet. Something settled. The specific quality of a person who has completed something large and is now on the other side of it. He puts his keys on the table. He sits down. You sit across from him. He says, "It's done." You say, "Tell me." He does. Not everything. There are parts of what happened in Osaka that belong to his father and to the world he was leaving and that he has decided to keep there. But enough. The conversation with his father. What was said? What was not said? The specific form in which Shiro Mori accepted, finally, that the gap is real and permanent, and that his son has built something that is genuinely, inarguably his own. The negotiation is over. Not because Shiro has given up hope. Because Shiro has done what he has always done with information that requires recalibration. He has recalibrated. You say, and Tadashi? Kenji says, my father handles the organization. What happens inside it is his domain. It always has been. You say, will he handle it? Kenji says, yes. You say, are you certain? He says, yes. He says it with the specific certainty of someone who has spent 32 years reading his father accurately. You say, okay. He says, okay. You sit together in the apartment for a long time. The city outside the window is doing what it always does. 14 million people, none of them required to notice your specific evening. The ramen counter down the street. The dry goods shop that has been there since the Meiji Restoration. Kenji says, I have been thinking about what comes next. You say, tell me. He says, I want to move the company headquarters to Tokyo. Permanently separate the operations from Osaka. You say, that's a significant operational restructure. He says, yes. You say, I know someone who's good at supply chain restructuring. He almost smiles. He says, I know you do. You say, what else? He says, I want to buy a house. Not the apartment. A house with a garden. You say, in Tokyo? He says, Kamakura. I have been thinking about Kamakura. You say, why Kamakura? He says, the light there is different. It comes in from the ocean at an angle that changes what it lands on. Arrives and leaves differently than the city light. You look at him. He says, you told me once that the light in Japan was the reason the work got better. That it arrived and left without apology. You say, you remembered that. He says, I remember everything you tell me. You sit with that for a moment. You say, a house in Kamakura. He says, with a studio. For the work. You say, I haven't been painting. He says, I know. You will. You say, how do you know? He says, because you came to Japan to build something real, and you have been building it. The painting will come back when the building has somewhere to be. You look at him across the apartment in the Tokyo evening. You think about the compliance presentation in the Shinjuku conference room. The answer behind the question. The man who prepared thoroughly because he considered preparation to be the courtesy. You think about the 7 dinners. The kitchen table. The drive to Osaka. The garden with the koi. Shiro Mori looking at the garden and saying he is better. You think about the 4 days you waited and the holding of the agreement and the returning with something settled in his face. You say, you're not who everyone thinks you are. He says, no. You say, what do they think you are? He says, either the heir who hasn't arrived yet or the son who left. Depending on who you ask. You say, what are you? He says, neither. I am the one who stayed long enough to build something that made the argument for me. You say, that took 10 years. He says, yes. You say, worth it. He looks at you with a specific look that he has had since the compliance presentation, the look of someone who has decided to see what is actually there rather than what he was expecting. He says, yes. You reach across the table. You put your hand over his. The city outside moves on without you. Kamakura will have light that arrives from the ocean. You will paint there, different work, darker and richer, and more true than anything you made before, the work of someone who found out what courage actually costs and paid it anyway. But that is later. Right now, this apartment, this table, this man who answered the question behind the question and waited for you to arrive at your own answer and did not rush the arrival. The navigation is not over. It is never completely over when the world you married into has the specific permanence of obligation and history and 3 decades of what his father built. But the thing he built, the company, the gap, the life that is his own, that is permanent too now. Made permanent by the conversation in Osaka. By 10 years of showing up. by the specific willingness to build something real in a space where the pressure was always to build something easier. The mountain outside Kamakura will be patient. The light will arrive without apology. You will either pick up the brush or you won't. You already know which one you'll choose. You always did.